Well, welcome back, Anagenesis. Daniel here. I want to talk with you a little bit about how you can know God and why you would bother. In other words, what it would do for you if you came to know God. And maybe the place to start is just to ask the question, would you like to know God? And I don't mean, would you like to know some things about God, but do you want to know God? Do you want to have a personal relation, a firsthand interaction with God? Now, I've asked the question, but I know that you do. Many of you have left your countries and gone through incredible hardship simply because you needed to interact with God. You needed to come to know God. And that set you on the search that has led you across geography and cultures to live in a new place. One of the promises that we have here in the book of Proverbs is the promise that it would set us on a path that would enable us to interact personally with God, to come to know God. And let me just give you an overview of what it looks like here in chapter 2, because all of Proverbs 2 is about how to know God and then what knowing God will do for you. And so kind of bird's eye view, the first verse tells us what the initial conditions are. In other words, what's the entryway that we pass through to start this process of coming to know God. And then once we walk through that doorway in verses 2 through 4, we engage in a kind of search, and that search is described here as being one of escalating intensity and of engaging more of who we are in that search. And then, beginning in verse 5 through verse 11, we're going to get two results, and each result comes with an explanation attached of why that will follow as we go down this path. And so the first result is in verse 5, and then the explanation is verses 6 through 8. And then the second result is verse 9, and the reason behind that, the explanation of that result, of that second result, is in verses 10 through 11. And then finally in verses 12 through the end of the chapter, through verse 22, we find out what knowing God will save us from, what it'll protect us from if we choose to go down this path. So let's do it. Let's go down this path and look at this passage one piece at a time. We begin with chapter 2, verse 1. This is the door through which we must step if we would know God. My son, if you'll receive my sayings and treasure my commandments within you. The path to knowledge of God begins with receiving this moral, spiritual instruction that we have in the book of Proverbs and retaining it within us. And let me just say, to treasure within means to memorize. I believe that's what this is indicating. We bring Scripture here at the beginning of this process. We bring Scripture into our minds, into our hearts, and we keep it there so that it can begin to change us. And let me just say, because I know whenever I speak to people about memorization of Scripture, there's some who think, I can't memorize. You can do this. This is something you can do. You will do it with God's help, and you will be successful in it. You can memorize. And so it begins by meditatively reading, memorizing, retaining what we have here in this book and in the rest of Scripture. And so once we've brought Scripture into our heart, into our mind, what that does is that sets us up, and this is verses 2 through 4, it sets us up for a search process based upon those Scriptures, upon those moral teachings that we've internalized. And what happens is we'll see this described as something that will gradually take more of who we are, more of you into the search process. You will progressively become more active, and it will include more of your whole person as you try to make sense of this God that you've heard about and the wisdom by which he created this world. And so verse 2, the beginning of this search goes like this. It says, make your ear attentive to wisdom, incline your heart. And you remember that means your awareness or attention. Incline your heart to understanding. The first step in the search is once we've encountered Scripture and retained it, not word for word necessarily, but retained what it's about in our heart, based upon that, what we do is we take our attention, our awareness, and we aim it at trying to make sense of these deep patterns of God in this world. And as we do that, as we give more and more of our attention, our focus over to understanding God's way in the world, there's a second stage. It leads us, verse 3, to pray. It says, for if you cry out for discernment, if you lift your voice for understanding. In other words, what happens is, as we begin searching to make sense of God's way in this world, that leads us to cry out, to pray, to ask him for help in making sense of it. And that prayer then leads us to a third level of search in verse 4. What it does here is it initiates an intentional, studied, persistent search for these patterns in the world that we're reading about in Scripture. It says, if you seek her as silver. Remember, her here is wisdom. Okay? That pattern of God's skillful work in making the world and in ordering human life and affairs. Right? If you seek her as silver, if you search for her as for hidden treasures. Now, just think for a second. If you go about searching for treasure, searching for gold or silver or jewels, how do you do that? First of all, you don't do it by sitting in an armchair. Okay? It requires you to engage all of who you are in it. And people who are really focused, really hopeful of gaining treasure, they do this in a systematic and studied way. They look at where the strains of minerals are, and they study before they set out, but then they actually go and they engage themselves in a search in which they are persistent and they are willing to endure hardship and sweat and face misfortunes along the way in order to acquire the treasure. Let me just say, this is what it's like when we begin to really search and make sense of God's way in this world, is that as we give it our attention, we then begin to pray, and that sets us out in a whole new way of life that engages all of who we are. Now, that search will result in two benefits. Two things will happen. You can know that these will happen if you begin to search for God and his ways in this world in this systematic, intentional, persistent manner. First result, chapter 2, verse 5. Here's the result. Then you will discern the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. In other words, remember, fear is how we register power in proximity. So when we discern the fear of the Lord, what we're doing here is we're beginning to actually see God's effective hand, his active presence at work in the world right where we're living. Okay? We see that he's here. He's in the room with us. He's in our business relations. He's in those interactions with family and friends and neighbors that we engage in day by day. He's here at work. And what happens is, as we begin to see him at work here, we find that now we're interacting directly with God. And that's what knowledge of God is. It's firsthand interaction, in this case with God. So we begin to see him and we realize we're interacting with him. And here's why. Verses 6 through 8 is the explanation. So we begin to see his hand at work and to interact with God directly because the Lord gives wisdom. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. He stores up wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk in integrity. He guards the paths of justice and he preserves the way of his godly ones. The reason that we begin to see God's hand in the world and interact with them is because the Lord himself personally begins to respond to us as we search for his wisdom in the world. I want you to notice this. We begin this search, we begin this process by memorizing and reflecting on Scripture and then engaging in a search to see how that matches up with the world outside. But as we embark upon this search as a way of life, what we begin to see is that God just cannot keep out of it. Okay? He personally begins to engage with us and to supply insight and supply wisdom along the way. He begins to open our eyes to his presence in the world, and so we begin to learn from God directly, not just through the words that we read, which is how it begins, but now we begin to learn from him immediately. Let me just say this. If truth is what you're seeking, and a little aside here, we have to be aware that there are a lot of things that we might be seeking instead when we say to ourselves and others that we're just seeking the truth. Okay? Sometimes what we're really seeking is reputation. What we're really seeking might be credentials. What we're really seeking might be kind of an insider status that makes us feel significant. So there's all sorts of other things that might really be what we're searching for when we say we're seeking truth. But I can pass this promise to you. If truth is really what you seek, you will surely find it. And the reason you will find it is not because you're so intelligent, though I'm sure you are. The reason you will find it is because God himself is that good and that kind, and he is incredibly responsive to us when we seek him and seek to understand his wisdom in this world. And so if truth is what you seek, you will surely find it. The Lord will make it available to you if you set your heart on him and on him alone. So that's the first result. We begin to see God's hand in the world. We're interacting personally with him, and that's happening because God himself gets involved and he gives to us as we seek. The second result we see in chapter 2, verse 9. And it says this, "Then you will discern rightness and justice and integrity or equity and every good path." This may sound familiar to you because if you go back to chapter 1 and verse 3, this is that triad of characteristics where we do the right thing, we make the right choice or decision, and we're the same person wherever we're at, no matter what's going on. So that moral character, which is the good life, the good person, as it's thought of in the book of Proverbs, that now becomes something that begins to make sense to us. We begin to see the interconnection, the intrinsic logic of the moral life and the good path, the path that leads to real life and flourishing for ourselves and those around us, that begins to just make sense to us. So that's the second result, is this insight into the moral good life. And here's why that happens. We have an explanation for each of these. So in verses 10 through 11, we're given the explanation of why we begin to see and just kind of make sense of the moral life. It says, we'll do that because wisdom will enter into your heart, and knowledge will become delightful or pleasant to your soul. You could even translate this to your appetite or emotion. Discretion will guard over you, and understanding will watch over you. The reason that we begin to see the interconnections of the moral life is because as we interact with God one-on-one through the search process, there's an emotional realignment that takes place within us. And that emotional realignment basically looks like this. As the skillful character or wisdom of God's ways fills our awareness, captures our attention, it says knowledge will become pleasant to our soul, to our appetite. It's what that means is our life force. It's all of those unconscious things that well up within us just because of the kind of physical being that we are. Those unbidden automatic responses get realigned to where they now delight in and they find pleasant interacting with things as they really are. That's the emotional realignment. So what that means is that what you're drawn to and what you're repulsed by will begin to change. That changes over time as we walk down this path. And we'll find that as we progress down this way, what was once alluring and enticing and difficult to resist now just begins to kind of look stupid and disgusting and pointless, and why would you bother? You see, one of the problems that we start out with so often in life is that we have this misconception that folly, thoughtlessness, or even further down the line, perverseness, all-out sin, is somehow a really good thing that would be so delightful and so much fun if only God didn't have this thing against it. And so we find ourselves battling desires that lead towards these really horrible results. And what happens is we go down this path and we begin to see God's wisdom. We begin to interact with God and discover His character through firsthand interaction. That changes our wiring on the inside. And what happens is we're no longer drawn to those things that once were enticing. And on the flip side, things that once we kind of felt were like drudgery but dutiful, we see the significance of them, and now they're meaningful and they're engaging, and they're life-giving and enjoyable for us to do. Our emotions are remade as we walk down this path. Now I want you to notice something. Chapter 2, verse 11 says that this realignment now, the discretion will guard over you, and understanding will protect you or preserve you or watch over you. Okay? So there's guarding and protecting going on here by this character in us. But go up to chapter 2, verse 8, a few verses before this. I want you to notice the same verbs are there, to guard and to protect or preserve or watch over. It may not come out in your translation, but it's the same two verbs. And in that passage, what is it that is guarding and protecting? It's the Lord himself. The Lord himself is guarding and protecting those who are walking in the right way. So which is it? Is it this renewed character, the realignment of emotion within us that is protecting us and guarding us? Or is it the Lord himself who is personally guarding and protecting us as we progress down this pathway? The answer is both. Both are doing it. And this is what you will begin to experience as you live this life of coming to interact with God, to know God personally, is that increasingly God's own activity will intertwine with what is happening within your own heart and your own emotional responses, so that you will find God's work outside you and around you, dovetailing with his work in you and through this transformation of your heart and mind. And together, those will provide a protection. God's own activity and the character that he shapes within you will protect you, it will save you from walking down all sorts of paths that lead to disaster. And I just point out verses 12 through the end of the chapter, through verse 22. I won't read them. I'll leave that for you to read. But I can just summarize. This tells us the long-term result of coming to know God. Okay? And this is the answer to why you and I should care, why we would bother coming to know God. And the reason is that when we come to know God, what it will do is it will save us from a host of self-destructive, futile, futureless pathways that otherwise would entice us and entrap us in this life. And so as we come to know God and he begins to interact with us in response to that search, that leads us to see him in this world, that leads us through a process of emotional realignment where we come to really delight in the good life and to lose any draw, any desire for those things that lead to destruction. And through that, the Lord sets us on a path that leads to flourishing order in this life. That's the promise that he holds out for you, for me. You can have it. You can have it today. It just begins by walking through that door to search for God and interact with him. Grace and peace to you.